All right. Well, I am very glad to be here, and I'm
Yeah,
here with
same.
my friend Lee Clarke, who we met online, and this is our first time face to face. We haven't actually connected like a whole lot, so I guess I'm using friend loosely, but I uh, I hope that's okay. And by
I'll
the
take
end
it.
by the end of this, I'm sure it will be true. Um, so yeah, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you study and what you wanted to share with us. And I know you informed me a little bit, but just for everybody who's watching.
Yeah, sure. So, hello, guys. My name's Lee. As you can tell by my accent, I'm from the UK. I'm mainly a philosopher by trade. I've just completed my PhD in philosophy over here, and I mainly specialise in cross-cultural philosophy, kind of comparative philosophy, mainly Buddhist philosophy, religion, and history of ideas in general. And I've published a couple of papers at the moment. It's kind of expanding on comparisons of kind of Buddhist philosophy and Christian philosophy, and I've got two upcoming papers on Buddhist and Christian views on universal salvation and the concept of God within a Buddhist framework. So I'm kind of I love obviously, as I've just said, like comparative traditions. I love kind of in the religious dialogue, interfaith dialogue, increasing understanding between different traditions. And really, if I were to give myself a kind of mission, if that's the right word for my work, it would be to hopefully, increase understanding between different people so we can live in a nicer world, or however little contribution I can make towards a nicer world.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm definitely curious about everything you said already. The Buddhist concept of God and the
Yeah.
Buddhist concept of universal salvation. Those are new sentences to me. I didn't. I usually hear of the Buddhist non-belief in God and the Buddhist
Yeah.
sort of salvation isn't even a question from what I thought. But I'm not
Mm.
educated on such topics. I only have a popular knowledge of Buddhism and a
Yeah.
passing familiarity. I read a bit of the Lotus Sutra once, and
Yeah.
I have some
That's a
brief
start.
opinions and that kind of stuff. But yeah. So tell me what's going on with all that? Is there a Buddhist sense of God in a particular lineage, or is that just
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question because obviously a lot of Westerners who have mainly grown up within a kind of within Christian cultures, Christian traditions. That's the first thing they ask about Buddhism or Eastern religions generally. Like, what do they believe about God? And obviously, for people watching, we met in a group about David Bentley Hart, right? And he obviously mentions Buddhism a lot in his works. And in my paper, what I kind of say is that I personally think it's difficult to include a traditional classical theistic conception of God within a Buddhist framework. Not impossible. And I want to kind of make it clear that that's not out of any want to not include God. It's not that I'm trying actively to exclude God. And if someone come up with a kind of foolproof way of doing it, I'll be like, awesome, that's great. We can build on that with other faiths, But I personally think it's difficult, but not impossible. I think that there is a kind of way of connecting with, I guess, what you could call the divine, something higher than ourselves, a higher kind of thing, through the figure of the Buddha himself. And there are plenty of other ways. But whilst I think, and you could kind of interpret that as God manifesting through the Buddha, etc. However you want. But I think there is a kind of way to include a conception of divinity that's kind of outside traditional parameters of the classical theistic tradition, but still enough to kind of like create a basis upon which we can talk about it, if that makes sense.
yeah, it makes sense for sure. I wonder if
Yeah,
you could expand it a little bit for our listeners who might not know what classical theism is. Um,
sure.
not that you have to explain the whole thing of classical
No, of
theism,
course, no.
but
No, I won't.
but
I won't bore listeners with that. So, classical theism is basically the conception of theism that exists in, well, I guess you could say kind of Neoplatonism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. I mean, you could even go so far as to say like Zoroastrianism if you really wanted, but it's mainly confined to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The conception of obviously those three traditions have different ideas about God in certain ways, such as the incarnation, obviously in Christianity. But the kind of general idea of God as creator, as sustainer, as a kind of permanent entity is common to all. So I believe personally, and again, this is, you might find 20 other scholars who say no, I'm completely wrong. You can include God, and I'll mention some in a minute, and that's great. Again, as I said, if you can find a way, then I'm all for it. But because of the kind of what's called the three marks of existence in Buddhism, which kind of define Buddhist metaphysics, and Buddhist metaphysics is on a very different plane to kind of Abrahamic metaphysics. Obviously, it's a completely different part of the world. And Buddhism kind of emphasizes kind of, instead of being kind of impermanence and kind of emptiness, but not in such a negative sense, instead of divine kind of fullness or substance, rather, would be the better way to put it. And because of that, it's kind of difficult to include God as he is within classical theism without kind of twisting it to, it's kind of like putting trying to put a triangle in a square in the little kind of shape toys we used to have, right? But I think that there is as I've said, a way to include a conception of kind of the divine or something higher than us, a higher power, whatever you want to call it, whatever you prefer to call it, in the figure of the Buddha. So obviously, if you want, I'll expand on that. Okay, so yeah, sure. So there is
the incarnation of the logos, or
yeah, kind of. It's kind of, so basically, there's a lot of well, not a lot. There's some misconceptions in kind of pop culture Western views of Buddhism, and the Theravada tradition, and basically just like in Christianity, you have different Protestants, you have Catholics, you have Orthodox. There are different kind of branches in Buddhism too, right? So in the Theravada tradition, which is the tradition in countries like Sri Lanka and Thailand and Laos, Cambodia, countries like that, there's a kind of idea that the Buddha was, they say, oh yeah, the Buddha was just a human and he was like a human teacher and stuff, right? And that's a valid viewpoint. You know, I wouldn't kind of say, oh yeah, you're completely wrong. But kind of, I want to say traditionally within Buddhist thought, the Buddha wasn't thought of as just a human, because Buddhas and humans are kind of different ontological beings, right? So within I'll try to explain this kind of basic terms for viewers who don't know. So within basic kind of Buddhist philosophy, obviously the world is defined by what's called dissatisfaction. You normally hear it translated as suffering, which is a translation of the word in Pali and Sanskrit, which is dukkha. You can say it's suffering. You normally see like life is suffering, but I find that's way too negative, and it gives a kind of, because when you think of suffering, at least in English, I think of like, you know, intense emotional or physical pain, and obviously it includes that, but it can also be something as mundane as being bored or stubbing your toe or being annoyed in a traffic jam or something, right? So it's kind of like saying Buddhism doesn't teach that, oh yeah, there's no happiness at all. It's not as negative as that, but it's kind of saying, yeah, there'll be happiness and you'll be great, but then something will happen to annoy you again. And Buddhism teaches the first noble truth that life is kind of defined by this. And many viewers would have heard of like reincarnation in conversations about Buddhism. So the idea is that obviously you will kind of come back over and over again until within a cycle, what's called samsara, and then eventually, you know, the very basic idea is really is to find enlightenment, and then you're out of it and you're good. So within and this is strictly within a kind of Buddhist traditional context, as if it were all true, right? As if this is how reality was. So the idea is that obviously humans and every other being really have lives defined by dukkha, by dissatisfaction, and constant rebirth and death and rebirth. So the idea is that the kind of logic is, well, if you suffer every time, like, why would you keep going through with it? Why didn't you just get out of it, right? And obviously the idea is that the Buddha has got out of it. So because the Buddha has got out of it, which is why he's called the Buddha, which is the enlightened one. It's a title. A lot of people think that's his name. That's a title. What he's achieved, right? So because the Buddha is no longer affected by this, he's no longer human logically, if that makes sense. So because he's no longer affected by what humans are said to be affected by, then he's something more than human, right?
So it's almost like a
So
reverse incarnation. Instead of God
of
coming
course,
down into a human is going
yeah,
up to become God.
yeah, of course. So there's never really, I mean, it's never been as much as Christ is defined in Christianity, right? I mean, there is kind of traditions within later Mahayana thought of the Buddha kind of only have like there was a heresy in Christianity called Docetism, which I'm sure you know, which is for you that don't know, it's the idea that Jesus was purely divine, his human life and body was just a complete mirage, and when he suffered, it was just like a show to save humans, and obviously that was not accepted by vast majority of Christians because they were like, well, if he didn't suffer in reality, then how can he relate to us? There's a similar kind of thing in Buddhism where it said that the Buddha had 3 bodies, and this is a doctrine that developed later on, and that's the Dharmakaya, which is kind of the closest you can get, which means truth body, the closest you can get to kind of divine kind of presence. It's said to be the kind of origin of all the Buddhas, so that's the most like high up thing. And then you've got the oh god, I've really got the name now, but he's like earthly body, which is like the kind of what you saw on Earth and everything, and then this body which appears within meditation. So basically, the Buddha was always considered in some sense to be more than human, but not to the extent that we would consider God within monotheistic traditions. I mean, there is a scholar called I've completely sorry, everything completely goes out my head when I'm on things like this. I can't believe I forgot his name. I'll remember his name in a second. The book's on my shelf. But basically, he says that the idea it's not really the same as a Western concept of divinity, because a lot of the Western concepts have kind of, you have heaven, then you have earth, and there's a line between them. Whereas in ancient India, in the Buddha's time at least, it was always kind of really fluid. It was always kind of going in to each other. So the divine and the human weren't strictly separate. So when they kind of said, yeah, the Buddha wasn't entirely human, because he was human, he was born human, and it was human, but then when he became enlightened, then he was something more. So my kind of paper says, well, I personally say that because there's something more than human, we can kind of take that as the something, whatever you want to call it, that's higher than ourselves. It's something to kind of look towards, to strive towards, that's ontologically higher than human beings. And
Would you say
obviously,
that's
and
almost like a teleology then, like it's ontologically higher, and it's also like our destiny and our fulfillment and our purpose?
yeah, of course, yeah. So the whole the kind of, because obviously I don't believe this because I'm obviously a Westerner, but in kind of traditional Buddhist metaphysics, time is infinite. So whereas obviously in Christianity, there's a final end, obviously, to which you go, and Buddhism there is as well. There's obviously enlightenment, but because there's kind of constant. But the thing is with samsara, the difference is that the Buddha isn't like God, is not omnipotent. The Buddha's not a creator or anything. He didn't create samsara. Samsara is just kind of there. It's just a kind of it's a kind of cosmic fact, is the way I write it. So you can't.
Does the Buddhist metaphysics then include like a first cause, an unknowable source from which all things come, or do they just sort of posit a cosmology in which everything happens?
Yeah. They kind of pause a cosmology. So the idea is that there's this cosmic fact. We don't know how it got here. It just is. It's really bad, and we should get out of it, right? And that's the whole of this. So obviously, the Buddha, or a bodhisattva, which is a kind of being that kind of reaches enlightenment the fastest they can to help others escape it. They can't destroy samsara, so they can't get rid of anything. They can just right, okay, we'll help you get out of it. And that's kind of all they can do. So I guess the final end, if there was a kind of final telos in Buddhism, would be no one left in samsara. Like no being left in samsara. That would be great. But obviously, you'd say, well, time's infinite. People are constantly being born, so that's probably impossible. It probably is, but that's the goal to which, at least in Mahayana Buddhism, to which everyone strives, that you become a bodhisattva and that you help as many beings as possible to escape
If
suffering.
time is infinite and there isn't an infinite number of people, then it seems reasonable that eventually the bodhisattvas
Yeah,
will accomplish their
yeah,
task. It may be a really long time from now.
sure. Yeah, and that would be great. And that, but that's the whole idea, that obviously you make a vow to say, right, okay, I'm going to become one of these, like, bodhisattva eventually, and it could take. I'm talking traditional Buddhism, not that I necessarily agree with everything I'm saying, but traditionally this could take like, oh, so many lives, but you're going to do it for other people. So there's really a kind of the kind of what you could compare with Christianity, the same compassion that obviously God incarnated himself as Jesus to save. There's that same compassion to save others within Buddhism too. So on that basis, they're very much is conversation to be had. It's about kind of putting others before yourself. So the whole point is, and there are two scholars who I will get the scholars' names at the end, who've wrote a book called it's completely on myself, is it there? It is. Yeah, it's classical theism and Buddhism, and how they say how to include obviously classical theism within Buddhism, and it's a really good. It's a good argument, to be honest. It's a really interesting argument. I don't know what their religious affiliation is personally, but it's really interesting. So there are, as I say, arguments for it, but as I say, personally think it's a little bit difficult, and I just think you could. My position is kind of like, keep trying to put God in Buddhism. Like, it'd be great, because as I said, we can have more conversations, because I often think that Buddhism is sometimes the odd one out in major philosophical and religious traditions, because there is no real concept of God in the same way as other traditions. So obviously, whilst you can say as a Christian, oh yeah, well, we disagree with Muslims, they don't believe in the Trinity, but we both believe in God and the Creator and da. So there's something there's some commonality you can speak about, right? But with Buddhism, because that central belief is not really there in the exact same way, it's more difficult. So that's why I'm all for trying to find God in Buddhism, because if we do, we can increase understanding and dialogue with other traditions. But while I think it's difficult, I just think we should focus on what's already there in Buddhism to make it kind of easier for us, and so we can kind of say, well, there's not exactly God in the same way as Buddhism, and within Buddhism rather, but there is a kind of concept of something higher than ourselves, some kind of ontological, I'll make up a word like kind of moreness, that we can look at. And obviously you could say there are similar states within Christian, Islamic mysticism, etc. So that there is kind of something we can talk about. There's not nothing. So that's kind of an argument in a nutshell in that paper, right?
Yeah, well, when you said nothing, it popped into my head. I wonder, so this is my ignorance revealing, but I'm pretty sure Nirvana means extinction, right? To be extinguished.
Yeah. Flame. So this is a common thing. Yeah. So it doesn't really. So it's a kind of difficult thing, because the way I think, because obviously Buddhist texts only really came to the West in the kind of 19th century, mainly British and French translators and stuff, right? And German too. So yeah. So Nirvana is basically. What it means is, the actual word means putting out, as in when you put out a candle, and the idea is that you put out the flames of samsara, and you're kind of free of it. But what happens after that is never really concrete, because obviously within Christianity you have a kind of set. Obviously, this differs between different churches. Obviously, if you go to the Catholic or the Orthodox Church, etc., there is a set doctrine, set beliefs. Within Buddhism, because there was no central authority when it was spreading and developing, there are lots of different kind of traditions, sub-traditions, blah blah, and beliefs. So Nirvana, the idea is that when you achieve Nirvana, you are free of samsara, and your skandhas, which is what the person is made up of, which I'll go into in a minute, in Buddhism, kind of dissolve. But then what happens after that we don't know. So there's a kind of a lot of things you could put there. Within Mahayana, what happened with Mahayana is, because when you say there are two schools of Buddhism, and I'm widely aware that I'm going off on tangents here, but we can come back and yeah. So as I said, there are two main schools. There's Mahayana, which I mentioned, and there's Theravada. So these aren't kind of rivals, as in like Protestantism and Catholicism or Orthodox Christianity. They're kind of just different views that developed. And basically, from what we know, the idea is that early Buddhism came, and the idea is that you achieve enlightenment and you're great, and that's it. You're awesome. You're saved, right? And this is from what I've read amongst scholars who are way more educated in the subject than myself. We think that there were some Buddhists eventually in India who were like, right, okay, well, I'm saved, that's brilliant, but like, what about everybody else? It's a bit unfair, right? Like, they all have to still kind of suffer, and I'm great. And they thought it was a bit too individualistic. So they kind of developed an idea that you don't just achieve the status of an arhat, which is the word that you the kind of person you are when you achieve enlightenment. You go for kind of complete full enlightenment, the same as the Buddha, which is in Sanskrit the word is Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, which is like complete full enlightenment, the kind of the furthest you can go in order to save others. And a concept developed within Mahayana, which is called, I'm going to pronounce this completely wrong, but kind of Aprasistha Nirvana, which basically, I'm going to pronounce it completely wrong for anyone who knows Sanskrit listening, I'm sorry, but it basically means unlocated nirvana. And the idea is that the Buddha and Bodhisattvas are in a kind of state which is not the complete kind of extinction of the kind of the lesser nirvana, and not completely kind of out of the woods either. So basically, it's the idea that the Buddha and other beings can return to the world. So they can move, which is why it's called unlocated nirvana. So they can move about and come back into the world in whatever form to save sentient beings. So again, whether its extinction really depends on kind of what tradition and what kind of branch you're following. But I don't think it's extinction as in complete non-existence. I think that's a kind of negative thing. I don't think that's really implied. I think you exist because obviously the traditions say that when the Buddha was enlightened, he didn't just like disappear. He was still like here in the world, and he taught for the tradition says like 45 years before he died, passed away into what's called parinirvana. And obviously, what happened to him after that, within, again, we don't know, but there were traditions that, like, he kind of stayed in some form, he was still present in some form, and that led on to the different doctrines I described about him earlier. So I don't think it means extinction personally. I get why it seems to mean that, but I kind of just think that you kind of exist in a radically different way to we do now.
Yeah. Do you think there would be any fair comparison with like an apophatic theology?
I do.
That kind of extinction where it's a nothingness, but it's a fullness.
Nothingness
that has a fullness to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yujuna uses the language. He says it's not a nothing as in privation, and rather we should call this nothingness everything.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a really good point, because there is a doctrine in Buddhism which is normally translated as emptiness. It's called shunyata. I'm sure some viewers might have heard of that. And basically, what happened with shunyata is it goes very well with apophatic theology, because shunyata does mean emptiness. But when you say emptiness in a Western context, it means something really bad, right? Because you say I feel empty, you feel depressed, and it doesn't mean that within a Buddhist context. So shunyata basically came from two ideas. One of them was the idea of dependent origination, which is the idea that all things are kind of linked together in some way by kind of, not in a mystical sense, but just by causal links, going back and back, and eventually you'll find everything. It's kind of like the branches of a tree. You go back and back, and eventually find they're all from the same, they're all from roots. So there was this idea, and there was the idea of anatta or anatman, which is no self, which is an obviously famous idea in Buddhism. And in contrast with, to be honest, I would say virtually every other major religion in the world, Buddhism says specifically that we don't have a permanent soul or a permanent self. Instead of that, what Buddhism says we're made up of are 5 things called skandhas, in Sanskrit at least, or khandas in Pali, which are the 2 kind of Buddhist languages in India. And literally it means heap, as in heap of stuff. And what they basically are kind of 5 interdependent things. So like our consciousness, our feelings, our perception, our mental formations, and our body. All of these are impermanent. All of these are interwoven, and they're constantly changing. So because of that, we can't say that we're any one of these things, and it's these things working together, constantly working together and changing, that give us in Buddhism would say, the illusion of an independent self. And what I mean by independent self is most people will look at I don't know, think of themselves when they were 10 years old and think, oh yeah, that's me. That's me in that picture. Like that's me that fell out of that tree or whatever. Yeah, Buddhism would say that we're deluded, that there's not the same, that we're not the same person, because we've completely changed since then. And this is fundamental to Shunyata, and the best way I can describe it is a text which is basically actually next to me, called The Questions of King Milinda. And Milinda was we think he was a Indo-Greek king in modern-day Afghanistan that converted to Buddhism after the conquest of Alexander the Great. And there were basically he kind of obviously conquered a bit of what's now the Indian subcontinent, and there were Greek and Macedonian settlers in those areas in Central Asia and India and Afghanistan, that some of which we know converted to Buddhism, right? Greco-Buddhism is a cool thing. I recommend looking it up. But so the text called The Question of King Milinda, and there's this king called Milinda who we think converted to Buddhism, and the story, and whether this is completely historically accurate, this completely historically happened, we don't know, but it's a cool story nonetheless. So there was this monk apparently named Nagasena who went to Milinda, and he kind of wanted to know about Buddhism, and it's a big, long text, like a philosophical debate, where he kind of persuaded him of Buddhism's truth, and he converted. But the self doctrine, which he explains to him, he kind of says, what's your name? And he says, are you Nagasena? The king says, and Nagasena says, well, that's what people call me, but that's not really me. So the king's like, well, right, okay, what do you mean? Then he explains the concept of the of no self, and basically what he compares it to, which I think is a brilliant way, is he says there's imagine a chariot. Obviously they would have had chariots in those days, so imagine a chariot, and obviously you have the seat of the chariot, you have the wheels and the axle and the reins and the horses, and the king said, yeah, right. And then he says, but which one of them is the chariot? And the king's like, well, none. And the idea, of course, is that none of them is. It's only a chariot when all of those things are put together. We can call it a chariot. So in the same way, it's only when all of these skandhas are put together within a being, a human or another type of being, that we can say it's a person. So that's the kind of thing. There is no kind of fundamental essence of the chariot. There's no fundamental essence of the person.
I wonder though. So I'm thinking John Vervaeke. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he, in his series "Awakening from the Meaning Crisis" on YouTube, he uses a similar example of a ship, where he says, you know, who's steering the ship, who's driving the ship? Is it the captain? Well, the captain isn't the one pulling the sails. The captain is the one doing the oars. The captain isn't actually steering the ship. No one is steering the ship. There's some kind of larger thing that's happening where the ship is being steered. No one can deny that, but it's not any one person who's actually doing it. And so that leaves us with this sort of what is this? What is it that holds the ship together and makes it do things? And he gives another example of a bird, where you can say on the one hand, well, what makes a bird? Okay, it's got a beak, it's got feathers, it's got
wings,
right? It's got all this stuff. That's a bird. And if it has all these things, a bird. He says, okay, well, if I took a dead bird and cut it up and just threw piles of stuff on the ground, and I said, here's a beak, here's some feet, here's a pile of feathers, would you say that's a bird? And you say, well, no, it's a pile of feathers and a beak, and it's
exactly,
bird, but it's not a bird anymore. And so, what is bird then? That it was, that it's not, and what is that thing? But there must be something. You know, I can't imagine that unity is illusory. I struggle with that, because if it were illusory, the bird would just be a pile of feathers on the ground. There wouldn't be a form. There wouldn't be a coherent structural, functional organization to the thing.
And that's exactly what the Hindus and the Jains and the said to the Buddhists, and I'll come on to the thing with no self in a minute, because there were numerous kind of arguments for this claim, right? But the point, to bring it back to what you said about apathetic theology, is if we understand this no self thing and this dependent origination thing, an even better example actually to describe the no self thing that people may have heard of is the ship of Theseus. The idea that if a ship replaces all its parts, it's still the same ship. That's basically how Buddhism views the self or the person. They're a constant. It's constantly being replaced moment by moment. So is it the same person? Well, Buddhism says no, it's not. But the point is, what I'm getting at, to bring it back to the apathetic theology bit, this is all relevant. I would just make, because if I say about shunyata without the other two, it's not going to make sense. Okay, so you've got this dependent origination and no self. So there was a philosopher in India from, we think about the 1st or 2nd century CE or AD rather, called Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna is one of the most famous philosophers in Buddhism. Like you can't really do anything about Buddhist philosophy without knowing about him. And what he basically did was he took both of these doctrines that I've just described and massively expanded them. So he rather combined them and then expanded them. So he said, right, so if we don't have a self, then nothing must have a self, and if everything's linked, then everything must be linked. And basically what this ended up as was a doctrine called, again, shunyata, which means emptiness. And so a lot of people hear this word and they look at it like everything's empty, and they think it's really nihilistic, and it means, oh, you're saying there's nothing. And that is what the other, well, even other Buddhists and Hindus, etc., described, accused Nagarjuna school, which is called Madhyamaka, of being. They said, you're nihilist, you're saying there's nothing at all, and if there's nothing at all, how can we even achieve anything? But Nagarjuna said, no, that's not what we're saying. What they're saying was, everything is empty of a word called svabhaha, which in Sanskrit is kind of means own being, right? Or kind of self-existence or self-being, right?
Everything is contingent in Western.
Exactly. So what Shunyata says is that not that nothing exists, but that nothing exists independently of something else. So everything at some point is kind of connected with something else. So there's no kind of clearly defined, this is me, this is you, this is that thing, this is this thing. Everything at some point kind of ontologically at least interweaves with each other. So nothing exists independently of anything else. And how that links to apathetic theology is that there is an idea of, because obviously with apathetic theology you can't understand God completely. You can only refer to God negatively with negative terms, because language can't describe God. And it's kind of the same with shunyata, but Buddhism kind of come up with a kind of way. They kind of said, right, well, obviously this is how, again, in Buddhism's view, the world is, but we can't go around referring to every single thing by its constituent parts. Like, instead of, I'll say, okay, we'll go in the car. Like, I don't say, okay, we'll go in the axles that's on the wheels, on the body, on the chassis with the doors, and it's like, no, we'll go in the car, right?
Yeah,
so you can recognize
hair and skin.
And of course, yeah. So yeah, yeah. So it recognised that obviously we have to refer to things by their constituent names within to navigate through the world, but they called this the conventional truth, whereas there is an element of truth to it, but it's not the ultimate truth, which is that in reality, to like someone who's enlightened, everything is empty. And obviously many people may have heard this before. There is a really famous scripture in Mahayana Buddhism called the Heart Sutra, which famously says form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And I'm sure some viewers would have heard of that. And basically what this it's like a page long, this scripture, it's one of the most famous, and basically what it says is that it kind of says that there's no skandhas, there's no, and it kind of goes through the primary doctrines of Buddhism, like the Four Noble Truths, and that says, right, yeah, this doesn't exist either, there's no this, it's all just emptiness. But it also says form is empty, but then it also says emptiness is form, which obviously means that there is a kind of space for the material world and what exists in it. But in reality, that's emptiness, and that kind of goes with apathetic theology, is that we can't really describe emptiness with ordinary language. Again, we can't describe everything by its constituent parts, so we have to use ordinary language, but it will never reach the exact way reality is, unless obviously you're enlightened. And I guess another comparison with that is in Orthodox Christian theology, the whole essence energies distinction.
Oh, I thought you say cataphatic, apophatic, but I
Yeah.
think they might be the same thing with different words. I'm not exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
So for viewers, obviously I know you know what that is, Justin, but for viewers who don't know, that's basically the idea that we can't refer to God in his essence, which is or Wisa, because we're so different ontologically from God, but we can refer to his energies, which are his activities in the world. It's kind of the same thing. I mean, in Buddhism, even in before Mahayana fully developed, when the Buddha describes nirvana, what they say, oh, you know, what's nirvana like? And he uses what we would term apathetic discourse. So he kind of says he doesn't refer. He just like it's a refuge. It's the unbroken, the unbirthed, the never ending, and kind of all terms, because you can't really describe it in human language. And obviously, for viewers who know about kind of Zen, that goes further in Zen Buddhism. But yeah, so the point is there is definitely an apathetic streak within Buddhism that's readily comparable with the way that God is described in many Abrahamic traditions. Even in rational Abrahamic traditions, for example, obviously Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher, was a great proponent of that, but he was more a rationalist than a mystic. But yeah, so it's readily comparable with apathetic theology, and there is again a kind of sense in Buddhism that there is a deeper layer to reality that we're unable to describe with ordinary language, that we're unable to see until we achieve it. And ironically, in that sense, you could describe Buddhism as quite Platonic, because Buddhists won't like me saying that at all, and Platonists probably won't either. But the point that there is a kind of deeper thing, that the things are more than their appearance, is common to, I would say, both Western and Eastern spirituality. But yeah, as we were saying about the self, as you said, there must be some unity to hold it together. Yeah, that is exactly what the Hindus and the Jains said to the Buddhists in India, and they argue for that. And obviously, there were loads of different arguments for and against that. But Buddhism is really the only major religion that makes this claim. That's completely different to any other religion. Even other religions in India, there wasn't really another philosophical school that said, yeah, we agree there's no self. So in that sense, they had to obviously, and people might be thinking quite rightly, well, okay, there's no self, then what reincarnates, and how do you solve this? And how do you solve this? And that is exactly what they had to answer. So yeah, so to kind of massively long-windedly answer your question, there is definitely an apathetic, even a mystical, you could say, streak within Buddhism, where you can't describe the ultimate reality, whether that's nirvana or God, or anything else, whatever name you want to give it. There is the sense that you can't describe it with human language, that it's so different from human experience that it's on another ontological level, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like it's inching towards classical theism, because that's sort of the argument for the unknowable God, the source of all things, is that there must be some kind of unity. We see it in the world. We don't know where it comes from, and therefore it must come from something which we cannot name, which is,
of course, and that's God, yeah.
Which is the classical theist understanding of God.
Yeah, and
the only question I wonder would be, like, in Buddhism, would you be able to ascribe any kind of desire, and even in classical theism, this is difficult. You can't say God has desire, but I mean also God is a person, and all that kind of thing. Whereas the being in and of itself that you described in Buddhism sounds sort of like more like an Aristotelian prime matter or something like that. That's like
yeah. Yeah, so basically the way that those scholars, I'll just get the names because I'll feel really bad if they ever see this. Okay, so it's Tyler Dalton McNabb and Eric Baldwin. They're the ones who wrote the Classical Theism and Buddhism book. And so I just wanted to mention them because I feel bad not referring to anyone by name. Yeah, so what they kind of say for their argument, and again I don't know their religious affiliation, but it's a really good argument. I say myself it's a good argument, even when I don't completely agree with it, but it's a cool argument. And they kind of say that that shunyata and no self, etc., only appeals to kind of things. And because God is within classical theism obviously not a thing or a being, of course, that it doesn't apply to God. And I struggle, and I kind of not wrestle with it, but I was like, okay, interesting. And I completely see their point, and I even say in my paper that this, to be fair, a lot of the argument, this does work. Where I kind of struggle with it from a Buddhist metaphysical perspective, a Mahayana one at least, is that with one of the reasons I say that it's difficult to put God within a Buddhist framework is because of the primacy, the ontological primacy of emptiness and impermanence. Of course, God, within a classical theistic perspective, exists eternally. He's always exists. And I say he, I'm sorry for using not gender neutral language, but I could, he or she, or whatever you want to call God.
Yeah, he or she. And I think that I would say that in classical, I mean, I'm not a scholar of classical theism, so maybe I'm just saying what I think in my theism. But I would not say that God as the ultimate being, but rather that God is the transcendent non-being. That God is nothing, meaning no thing. The source from which being comes, rather than the ultimate fulfillment of being. It's actually something beyond that. For me, I would say the logos is the fulfillment of being, and God the Father is, or the Mother is, in my Trinitarian language, would be the nothingness, the emptiness, the nothing which is full, which is from which all things come, and yet about which nothing we can know, except that all things come forth from it. And that is very similar to McNabb and Baldwin's argument. But where I struggle with it again speaking from a strictly Buddhist metaphysical perspective, is that because of the primacy of shunyata and impermanence, which is one of the three marks of existence, they would, in my view, and there may be many that disagree with me, but in my view, if that they have to apply, because within a Buddhist framework, this is how the universe is. I'm not saying that this is completely what I think, but I'm just saying that this is what a traditional Buddhist perspective would say. So I just want to make that clear to viewers, right? So say that this, for argument's sake, that this is all true, that the way Buddhism describes the cosmos, the universe, is true. Those concepts of impermanence and emptiness would have to apply to everything, and God could not be metaphysically outside it, which would mean they apply to God, which would mean that obviously it's not the God of classical theism, because God isn't impermanent, and God is obviously being itself, but he's also obviously not dependent upon other things for his existence. And obviously, of course, in classical theism, God is self-existent. So I say that because, and of course, what McNabb and Baldwin says, that God is not a thing. I'm like, I'm not a being, and I get that. But where I struggle is because of Shunyata's position in Madhyamika philosophy, specifically as the ultimate truth. Within a classical theist perspective, God is the ultimate truth, of course. But if you have Shunyata as the ultimate truth, then that would cancel God out, and you can't have both simultaneously because they're logically contradictory. So that is why, personally, I think it's difficult, not impossible by any means, but difficult to include God as he is imagined, as they, he, she are imagined within classical theism, within a strictly Mahayana Buddhist metaphysical perspective. But there are ways, like David Bentley-Hart in his The Experience of God does kind of say that his description of theism is even applicable to some versions of Mahayana Buddhism, and I think that's true. But and I kind of say in my paper as well, that I think it's difficult but not impossible, and there are ways of doing it. But I just think because of the ontological primacy of emptiness and impermanence, and kind of I'll coin it, well, not coin a term, but non-substance, non-essentialness, right? It's difficult not to include God. Are you familiar with the threefold path of Christianity, the triple way, the three stages that have different names at different points, but it's purification, illumination, perfection, or sometimes it's called purgation, illumination, and union.
I'm not kind of like, I've not done massive reading into it, but I've heard of them. But go on if you.
Yeah, I think it might be helpful, because that's when I asked about the apophatic theology. That's what I had in mind, and so maybe I'll just lay out the threefold path in a quick sort of schema. The premise of it is that it begins with the physical body. So we start with the outer person, and then we move to the inner person. So we start with what's manifest, and we move towards what's less manifest. And so this is a path of spiritual formation within the monastic tradition of Christianity.
Of course.
And so you begin with the outer person, and that includes fasting, chanting, manual labor, those sorts of things. And
Hmm.
then in the first stage of purification, you also begin to learn about your passions, which are essentially your emotions, and your vices, which are essentially your thoughts, vices and virtues,
Yeah,
which
of
are
course.
essentially your thoughts. And you learn to bring harmony to the self, and the goal is to achieve a state of apatheia in the Greek, which means no passions,
Yeah, yeah,
apatheia, without passion. And the word passion means suffering, which is why we have in Christianity the idea of the passion, Christ's passion. It
of
didn't,
course. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Passion of
So
Christ. Yeah,
I'm explaining to you and also to the listeners.
yeah, of course.
So
Yeah.
the it means, like you were saying earlier, we think of suffering as like intense emotional or physical pain, but
Mm.
actually the suffering of Christ includes that. But to suffer something in older language means to endure it, and to have
Of course.
something
Yeah.
imposed upon you, right? So Christ suffered when he was nailed to the cross because of the pain, but also because he couldn't move, because he was literally just, something
Suspended.
else took
Yeah.
control of him, and he
Yeah.
he no longer had agency. His freedom was removed, and so
Mm.
to suffer means to lose your freedom. And so the passions. That's why we say that we lose our freedom with the passions, because when you have a really strong emotion, you do things you wouldn't normally do. Like you're so angry, you said something stupid, you calm down, and you're like,
Yeah. Of course.
right? I didn't mean
Yeah.
to do that. It took over me,
Yeah.
and I lost my freedom. And so the passion, the suffering, um, is like that. And so apatheia is the condition of the soul wherein we no longer are controlled by our passions. It doesn't mean that we don't have them. Well, depending on who you read, I would say it doesn't mean we don't have them, but it means that we're in a healthy, balanced, dynamic
Yeah. No,
relationship with them.
I'd agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're able to withstand the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And so that's stage one. That's purification. Um,
Yeah.
and you move from purification into illumination. And the language is important because the illuminative stage is about light, and then the third stage is about darkness, right? So the illuminative stage, and Buddhism has enlightenment. So I'm curious how this might all fit in. But
Yeah. I can say. Yeah.
once the soul is purified, it is able to receive the light, and so it does, and it's filled with the light, and it becomes the light, and it reflects the light, and it becomes a source of light itself. um, and so the path of illumination in the second stage is often, it's about philosophical exploration, it's about logic and reason and science. It's also about sort of encountering mystically God in nature, in what is created, in our fellow human beings, in the sunset, and all of that stuff. Eriugena has this beautiful description in his commentary on Dionysius' celestial hierarchy,
Yeah.
where he's trying to describe this theoria physica, this natural contemplation, where through the created world we see the one who made it. And he describes, he's writing in the early Middle Ages, presumably in a scriptorum made of stones and wooden beams and stuff like that. And he says
Mm.
that these wood and these stones become what he calls leading and introductory lights. And so they glow with the light, and it's a light that leads me into the source of light. And the source of light cannot itself be light, just as anything cannot be its own source, right? So
Mm.
nothing creates itself. Everything
Yeah. Yeah.
everything has to be created, and then it can create something else.
Mm.
Um, and so the light's source is darkness. Just like when we look up at the sun, we can't see the sun itself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
All we
We
see
just
is
see
the
the.
light that comes from it,
Yeah. But
because it's
the
blinding.
rays.
You can't see past the light into the heart of the sun. You can't do
Yeah.
that. And so the illuminative stage, the enlightenment, is to see the light. And then the third stage is to go beyond the light, through the light, not to discard it, but to be introduced by it, through it, into the apophatic darkness, into the emptiness, into union. It's called union, and it's called perfection. And perfection, here's another one for the listeners, doesn't mean what we think it does today in the old world. So it's
Yeah.
not straight teeth and straight A's, as one might think of perfection today. It's actually the completion of what something's meant to be. It's the fulfillment of purpose. It's the wholeness of a thing. It's destiny, and that sort of thing. And so when we come into perfection, as Jesus does say, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, which means be exactly what you were meant to be, as God is exactly what God is. I am what I am. I am that I am. I will be what I will be. And that will be what we will be, according to Eriugena and Dionysius in the mystical apophatic Christian tradition, is a darkness, is an emptiness, is nothing. And so we become nothing, but it's, like I said earlier, the nothing that is the fullness of all things. It's no thing because it's the source of all things, not a privation. We aren't extinguished in nirvana, the final stage. I wonder if the final stage being, moving beyond the light is the same as extinguishing the light in a symbolic sense, and we move into the uncreated darkness of the undescribable, what cannot be said. And that feels kind of like the Buddhist path you were describing of enlightenment, leading to nirvana.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I love Eriugena personally. I think he's way underrated. I think like, a lot more people should know about him because he was brilliant, and like he was for those who don't know, he was actually one of the only people within probably most of Western Europe, especially definitely the British Isles, that still knew Greek at that time, which is why he could engage with Dionysius at all. He's brilliant. So if you, especially if you're a Christian, if you don't know Eriugena, definitely look him up because he's awesome. I really like him for that. Yeah, so there's a lot. So that you definitely could compare that spiritual path with the Buddhist path, but obviously. And what you were saying is, I'm going to go a bit into Christianity here, but obviously we can bring it back around because my PhD thesis was on it was basically at its heart a comparison of Buddhist philosophy and kind of ancient Greek philosophy, based on the ideas of a French scholar called Pierre Hadot. And if you don't know Pierre Hadot and you're into, or someone just in the channel, definitely look at his work. And basically, what he rediscovered is the idea that ancient philosophy. Because obviously, do you think of philosophy now, and you think of like obviously, you're in a university or you're looking at, you're reading texts, and you're constantly reading texts, and you're saying, "Oh, this is what Plato thought or Aristotle thought." Yeah, that was there. But what Pierre Hadot rediscovered was that philosophy wasn't just something in the ancient world. I'm talking Greco-Roman world that you studied. It was something that you lived. It was called in Greek is a bios, which is a way of life. It was a way of life. So the idea of ancient philosophy of most schools were obviously, when I say schools, just to confirm for this, I mean the Cynics and the Stoics and the Platonists and the Aristotelians. All of them are different ways, but the goal was ataraxia or apatheia, which Justin just mentioned. And the goal was kind of inner tranquility, inner peace, inner kind of calmness and control over the passions. And the passions in ancient philosophy, which Christianity inherited, were obviously, like anger and pain and kind of intense, I would say intense emotions personally. And people and philosophers like and obviously there were different views on this. Like Aristotle was like, yeah, it's fine to feel some anger. You can feel anger, but obviously like righteous anger. But especially the Stoics, and the Buddhists too, were like, no, anger's bad. You need to control it. You need to control these passions. And Christianity inherited this idea, and where Pierre Hadot is also, which goes into what you were saying about the three stages. Pierre Hadot is most famous because his main idea, because obviously he didn't create the idea of philosophy as a way of life. He rediscovered it through his interpretations of these texts, and it's now quite widely accepted. But his most controversial idea that he kind of, not strictly formulated, but kind of formulated, was the idea of spiritual exercises. And that's the idea that these schools, when you became a philosopher, you lived in a certain way, you picked a certain way of life, and you did physical, kind of psychological, spiritual exercises, physical exercises that could include things like meditation, or, for example, imagining yourself kind of looking at the earth to see how puny, the things, the glory and riches and stuff are. All kind of different, and also kind of going through how you acted at the end of the day and going and to kind of eventually essentially purify your soul yourself. And some scholars don't agree with that. That's how it was. I personally do, and Hadod and a lot of others did. And Christianity also, and I don't know if listeners might know this, but Christianity, when it first came about, defined itself as a school of philosophy to compete with the Greco-Roman schools. And obviously now people think of philosophy and they think of religion, but that distinction was not there in antiquity at all. And you can tell this because in late antiquity especially, because eventually all the different philosophical schools kind of molded and folded and then became Neoplatonism of Plotinus and Porphyry, etc. And the Christians saw the Neoplatonists as competition, and they didn't say, oh, well, it's okay because we have a religion, but they have philosophy, so it's all good. They're like, no, they're offering salvation as well. That we need to show that we're better than them. So Christianity did define itself as a philosophy, as the supreme philosophy, of course, but it said that we're a school of philosophy as well. We're the culmination of all the rest of the philosophers, of course. Listeners may know Justin Martyr. He was a first century Christian apologist who kind of said, well, the Logos touched Socrates and touched Plato and Aristotle before it went into Christ. So they kind of said that Jesus, and obviously this whole idea is present within the idea of the Logos itself, which is obviously a philosophical concept, that Jesus is the ultimate philosopher, really. That Christianity is the ultimate philosophy. And with that, of course, came these spiritual exercises, and of course Christianity, and I don't want to say took over, because that sounds like I'm kind of saying, Christianity imposed itself. I don't mean that at all, but it inherited
is the word I was going to use.
It inherited these traditions, and eventually they became obviously Christian exercises, and that kind of culminated in I think it's literally called Spiritual Exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, who was the Spanish Jesuit. And Hadot was educated by the Jesuits just in the years of World War II, and he kind of looked at these texts, and he could read Greek and Latin, and he looked at these texts and he was like, oh, this is what they were doing, and he kind of traced it back. So interestingly, because I love this kind of period and this kind of intellectual history, what you said about the three exercises, excuse my
the 3 stages, it's usually
3 stages, yes. So
that's exercises, and when you get to different parts, there's not exercises anymore in the apophatic stage because you can't do anything nothingness. But
So that's basically a Christian spiritual exercise, right? And even when you said you get to the apophatic stage, that just sounds exactly like Neoplatonism, with the one. And
it is Neoplatonism. It's the Neoplatonic threefold path that got inherited into Christianity, for sure. Yeah.
And you can't, and obviously when you get to the one, you can't say anything about the one. So. Yeah. But and one of my favorite kind of things within, well, not just philosophy, it's intellectual history in general, is I love kind of seeing history as well, where different cultures and ideas will come into contact with each other and influence each other. And there may have been some kind of influences, not conscious, between Buddhism and Greek philosophy. And the best book to read about that, if you guys are interested, is called The Shape of Ancient Thought by a guy called Thomas Machiavelli. And I think he wrote this over like 30 years. And he finished it like 2002. And it's basically a massive kind of comparison of Greek and Buddhist philosophy and whether they influenced each other or not. And he kind of says there were 2. He thinks that a lot of them, not everything, but a lot of them did. I happen to think they did as well. And there were 2 main stages. One of them is when the Persians, which by Persians I kind of mean, if you watch the movie 300, those Persians, when they controlled parts of India and parts of Greece, and obviously when Herodotus was going about writing his history, basically, and you would have had Greeks and Persians mixing in the Corn and stuff, and you could have had exchange of ideas there. And another one was obviously the one I said earlier, which was the conquests of Alexander and the settling of Greeks and Macedonians in parts of the east. So you definitely could have had because some viewers might be like, oh well, that's similar. What you said similar to what I was saying, and I think there was definitely space for exchange of philosophical ideas between the West and Buddhism, whether they're conscious or not, probably not. but there's there were definitely Greek and Roman traders that went to India a lot. There was loads and loads of trade between Rome, the Roman Empire, and India. In some kind of monasteries in India, there are written down that there was trade with what they called in Indian languages yonas, which are Greeks, and Romakas, which are Romans. So there was definitely, there was definitely the kind of idea. And obviously, when you think of traders, they would have to learn each other's languages, right? So what I think we miss in history is that most people in history couldn't read and write, of course, right? So what I think people miss is all the conversations that would have taken place just anyway. Like, you would have had a Roman trader go to, I don't know, a Buddhist monk, like, oh, so what do you guys believe about something? And there would have been so many conversations like this that just are unrecorded and we don't know what happened. But there is definitely space for mutual influence between.
Yeah, and I think that
Yeah.
that period of history when Christianity was coming forward and Neoplatonism was coming forward, that there was this cultural, I mean, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm just saying what I feel like is true. But I feel like it's true that there was this emphasis, a cultural sort of widespread, subconscious emphasis on synthesizing and harmonizing various traditions. There was this syncretist movement that was happening, and Neoplatonism. We call it Neoplatonism, but you could also call it late stage Platonism, because they were
of course I would have said Neo.
They're just Platonists who happened to be around the same time as the early Christians, and they were interested in bringing all the traditions together. So that's what the late stage Neoplatonists did, Plotinus and them. They brought Stoicism and Aristotle and Plato, and they tried to say, look, we can do it all. Right? Let's bring it in. Let's do it all. Let's take the best of everything and smash it into a new thing. It was a brilliant idea. I mean, I'm really glad they did it.
Of course it is.
And Christianity, I mean, I get in trouble for this sometimes for saying this, but I think Christianity is a perfect example of that
me too. I do too.
It's a clearly syncretist tradition. It's a smash up of Hebrew traditions and Israelite traditions with Greco-Roman culture, and it's in
definitely
Greek, right? It's fulfilling Hebrew prophecies in a book written in Greek.
Of course.
So just at its heart, it's cross-cultural to begin with. So with all of that going on, it seems unlikely that the Buddhists wouldn't have had some say in there, like you were saying, with all the trade and everything, and just the cultural milieu. It doesn't have to be like the popes got together, the Buddhist pope, and that.
Of course. It
doesn't have to be an official coming together and deciding to blend stuff, but just the fact that there was this huge metropolitan multicultural. Alexandria was a modern day Toronto with all the cultures of the world there, interacting and sharing food and loving and hating each other and all of that stuff.
I mean, Alexandria is, when people say, "Oh, where would you go back in history?" Yeah, I'll go ancient Alexandria. Ancient Alexandria is one of my favorite things to read about. I love it. But to be honest with you, there are some. I'm sure you've heard of Clement of Alexandria. He mentions the Buddha, right? Yeah, in his. Well, I really apologise that I can't remember certain texts, right? Because I get quite flustered on things like this, but I'm good.
Okay.
So if you guys want to know, obviously the text, put a comment and I'll reply on my own. I think it's called. I'm going to say the Stromata. That's probably not how you pronounce it. One of his works, and he just kind of throws a mention of the Buddha in there. He says, "Oh, and further, I think he's mentioning different philosophical schools. I think." And basically, due to again Alexander, the Greeks and the Romans always had the idea of Indian philosophers as being composed of two groups. There was the gymnosophists, who were the kind of, which means naked wise men, who were the kind of, we think, as we would see Hindu and Jain ascetics today, that was them. And then you had what they called the Stramanas. Now, Stramana was, so basically the name of all the traditions like Buddhism and Jainism, which are the two most prominent examples that survive today, who were traditions of Indian philosophy that didn't agree with the Vedas and kind of not went against it, but formed new traditions. And they were called Samanas, the wanderers, wandering ascetics, wandering teachers, right? So obviously this word was passed from Indian languages to Greek. So the Shramanas when you hear it mentioned, they may have been Buddhists, they may not have been Buddhists, they could have been Jains, but there was always this, but they knew about Indian philosophers vaguely, and they knew that they were composed of these, in their mind, these two groups. So Clement is on about these groups, and then he kind of throws in, we know the Indians worship a being known as Buddha, who would the elevate as a saint due to his sanctity. Just a throwaway line. And of course, people are like, oh well, how was this? How did he know? And Saint Jerome actually mentions Buddha as well, which I'll come on to in a sec, which I found really cool. So basically, I wrote a paper which is free to read if you want to read. If you just type in Lee Clarke Stoicism, it will come up. It's free to read. Comparison of Buddhism, Stoicism. At the beginning, I talk about these Greek and Roman and Indian context, whether there was any influence. And obviously I mentioned Clement, and people are like, oh, well, where's this come from? And obviously, well, I think the obvious kind of answer is he learned it from traders. He was, there would have been sailors and traders coming back all the time. He would have friend of a friend or whatever. There's so many different ways. He thought, oh yeah, but what's India like? Oh well, they worship this guy called. But oh yeah, oh cool, I'll write that down. So he would have learned it through that. And I'm pretty sure there was an Indian community in Alexandria as well. I forgot where it's mentioned, but one writer mentions, oh yeah, blah blah blah. This was happening, and loads of crowds come and Sisypheans and Greeks and Indians, and just a throwaway line. So I'm pretty sure there was some kind of Indian community there. Whether they were Buddhists, we don't know. The other reference where they might have been Buddhists is from Philo of Alexandria, who was obviously, for viewers that don't know, the great Jewish synthesizer of Greek and Jewish thought, who was a contemporary of Jesus. He mentioned in one of his books that there were people called the Therapeutae, he calls them, that lived on the bank of the Nile. Now, obviously, we get the word therapeutic from that, but some scholars, and not all, but some scholars think this may have been a corruption of Theravada, which
I've never heard that before.
It's a theory, it's a complete theory, so it could be completely wrong, but there is a theory that maybe these were kind of descendants of the missionaries sent by Ashoka or something. Maybe they were Buddhists or Greeks who had learned, but they could have been. And then the other way is through Philo of Elis, who was a philosopher who is the founder of the skeptical tradition in Greek thought, the skeptical school, who went with Alexander to India. And the idea is that he, the kind of stories that he met Indian philosophers who may have been Buddhists and Well, so I spoke about this on another podcast, that everyone's like, oh, he's influenced by Buddhism. This is really cool. And I'm like, okay, was he influenced by Buddhism? Possibly. Could he have got all of that from Greek thought as well? Yeah, or also, yeah. But there is a definite sense where there may have been some contact. And with Christianity, especially, not so much in the, obviously, I say Clement mentions, and whether there were Buddhists in Alexandria, there well could have been. If there was concrete evidence, I would be very, very excited. I would think that was really cool. And the other one, which I completely just forgot to mention, I'm so glad I remembered it, is there was a statue discovered in an Egyptian port called Berenike in 2022, actually. And it's a statue of the Buddha, a broken statue of the Buddha. And scholars think that the style is Alexandrian. So whether that means that there were Buddhists in Alexandria or people at least familiar with, but that opens a whole range of possibilities that we just don't know. But that statue is definitely a thing. And obviously in Greco-Buddhism that I mentioned earlier, some of the first images of the Buddha, the ones you will see in garden centres in the US, we've got them in garden centres all over here in the UK. Some of the first statues were created by Greek immigrants or Indians influenced by Greek artistic techniques, which is where you will see the famous statues of the Buddha. Looks like he's wearing a toga, and that was obviously from Greek and Roman influence. So there's definite room for contact here. But I mean, I know you said you get in trouble saying Christianity is syncretic. I mean, it is. I don't really. I don't. I don't think it's any disrespect to. I mean, Buddhism is incredible, Islam is incredible. I don't think it's any disrespect to Christianity. I won't be saying it if it was to say that it is syncretic. I mean, if you go into, for example, okay, so obviously you say there's an unbroken tradition from the apostles, of course, but then would Christianity be what it was? Would the doctrine of the Trinity have been formulated as it was without the Greek influence? Well, no, probably not. I mean, if you go into the 4th century debates about the Trinity, I mean, you wouldn't have been able to make head or tail of it without some kind of philosophical education. You know,
even the Gospels themselves. I mean, John is clearly Stoic. The Gospel of John is a
of course.
Stoic gospel, right? It opens with a reference to the Logos, which is the Stoic concept, and everything in the Gospel of John you can just sort of map it onto Stoicism, and Jesus
You
is
can,
the
yeah,
perfect
yeah.
Stoic philosopher. And so it's just like it's everywhere in there, and even in like the Old Testament, especially the what gets called the Apocrypha or whatever. But if you read the Wisdom of Solomon or something like that,
Yeah.
like you've already got this Jewish Greek influence going on, and they're living right beside each other, right next. Like nobody would ever doubt that the French and the Spanish have influenced each other.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But for some reason, the Greek and the Hebrew is right beside each other. No.
Yeah, it's like British people that like to deny that French influenced English, but yeah, it did.
Yeah, but then you go to the grocery store and you look for your aubergine if you're British, and
Yeah.
in Canada we're like, why are you talking French? Because we're bilingual, and we call
Yeah,
eggplant
of course.
and aubergine, but aubergine is French and eggplant is English in Canada.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, you can even go further than that. I mean, obviously, there's this bizarre idea that I've seen it. I've seen it on some Facebook groups and stuff. This idea that Christianity was like corrupted by its contact with Greek philosophy and everything. I was like, what do you mean?
Yeah, I know
And
so many people who say that, and I try not to be disrespectful
yeah,
because it's a really important belief to people, and
of course, yeah,
all that.
that's fine.
But it's just like it doesn't understand the history of it to say that.
Yeah, I mean, even if you, I mean, not only just what I said about that they define Christianity as a school of philosophy, but even if you go to Oregon, we have this amazing actual document. I think the guy was called Theodore, and he was basically, I'm pretty sure he was pagan. I don't know if he was either Christian or pagan, and he basically went to what's now Beirut in Lebanon to study law, but he stopped over in Palestine, met Oregon, and stayed with Oregon. And Oregon is my absolute favorite Christian philosopher. I would love to have a cup of tea with that guy. I love him so much. I love Oregon. So he met Oregon, and he stayed with Oregon for 5 years, right? And he became, I think, if he wasn't Christian already, he definitely was by then. Anyway, and he wrote down what Oregon taught him, and this has survived, which is brilliant. And he wrote that Oregon would teach all the pagan schools, pagan apart from the Epicureans, because of course the Epicureans were considered to be atheists, but he would teach the Platonists, he would teach the Stoics, and then when the student had mastered all of those, then he would teach Christianity and theology. So there was no, and Oregon was a Neoplatonist, and if you kind of said that they were completely separate,
Neoplatonists were Origenists. It's hard to say because they were
all that, but they would. Most Christian philosophers would have, especially Alexandrians, for goodness sake, would have found it bizarre if you tried to completely separate Christianity, because obviously, I think people kind of forget that obviously, the Christianity didn't arise in a vacuum, and the same with any other religion, by the way. Yeah. It arose in the Greco-Roman world and was obviously going to be influenced by the cultures around it. And of course, when you had later pagan converts, it was and it's no disrespect to it's not saying that, oh well, it didn't come from the apostles. Of course you can say that, of course you did, but Christianity in its kind of doctrines, as its doctrines were, you could say in being revealed, being remembered, being formulated, was influenced definitely by Greco-Roman culture. I mean, and even further east, you could even say Persian, if you go back to when the Jews, of course, were as the Hebrew Bible says, were in Babylon, and they were influenced by Zoroastrians and the whole dualism there. So you could even say that Christianity is just a mixture of traditions,
I think that's what makes it beautiful, and that's part of why I love, I do Celtic Christianity, because in my mind it's just a continuation of that process, right? Christianity reaches this new place, and it absorbs all this new stuff and it becomes something the same but different, and has a beautiful expression and incorporates the Tuodedanen and the fairies just in the same way that the Christians, incorporated daimons and arches and Greek concepts of supernatural beings into the New Testament itself. Paul talks about archons and
he does, yeah,
all this kind of stuff, and that's all stuff that existed before Christianity. Paul isn't making up the idea of an archon, right? And Jesus didn't make it up either. Yeah, and I mean, I think we should probably start wrapping up. I wanted to say, I liked that you mentioned Clement and his connection, all brief as it may be, with Buddhism. Because Clement has this great line that I think sums up a lot of this really well, where he said that Plato was the Moses of the Greeks.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he does say that.
The Jews had Moses to teach them the law, to show them things that are true, but it wasn't complete yet until Jesus came. From the Christian perspective, at least. My apologies to all the Jews who are watching. But in the same way that God gave the Greeks Plato. To teach them and to show them the right way, and to lead them and to prepare them so that Christ could fulfill that in them. And I don't see any reason why we would think that Clement himself wouldn't assume Buddha in the same role as Plato. Clement would probably equally say Buddha is the
one to the Indians.
Yeah, the Moses of the Indians, or whatever, however he might word it. And that's just how people thought. And that's how.
Yeah, and just before we wrap up, another kind of good, not obviously off on the whole tangent because we need to wrap up soon, but if you look at the what we call the Church of the East, the Nestorian Church, for those who don't know, so these are obviously mainly Persian Christians who penetrated deep into Asia. They reached China. They were all over Central Asia. They were, and if you don't know the history of the Church of the East, look it up. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But they went down the trade routes of the famous Silk Roads, and they got to China. And obviously there they came into contact with Taoists and Buddhists, etc. And if you look at the famous book, The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan, I don't know where this document comes from, but he sought to document from one of these missionaries who had heard about the Buddha and said that he'd obviously been touched by the Holy Spirit, which I thought was really nice, So yeah, I really hope that more evidence is found, because I'm sure there's more evidence out there waiting to be found that there was much more sustained contact between Christians and Buddhists and other traditions, because I just think it would be, and that this stuff is more publicly known, not just to specialists, and because with the world, it's so interconnected, it's becoming increasingly more interconnected, East and West, etc., and we need to understand each other, especially from religious perspectives, so the more evidence that can be found that humanity, which is true in my opinion, has always been a melding pot, the better, really.
Yeah, so, I'd be perfectly happy to have Buddhism come into the big family, and I think from what I understand, most Buddhists would be happy with that too. At least the ones that I've watched on YouTube or whatever, like Thich Nhat Hanh or something. Yeah. But anyway, this was a lovely conversation. I'm not sure if we have a final conclusion to say to anyone. There's just a whole bunch of thoughts that I love to have. But I very much appreciate your time. And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you too. If you ever have me back at some point, I'll be happy to return. But I hope the viewers enjoyed. What I said. I'm sorry if I got a bit flustered. I forgot some stuff and some text. If you want to know anything more, put a comment on Justin's video, and I will comment back on my own YouTube account. But I do apologise for that. But I hope I conveyed some at least interesting stuff and
kept people interested. A lot of fun. I think it was super interesting. Yeah. I think people are going to be curious for sure. So, but they can decide for themselves. And
of course.
I've got to go and get ready to take care of my baby and do some things. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day across the
you too.
All the best. Cheers.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.